cover the basic idea of what borderline personality disorder looks like, what bipolar disorder looks like. Now we're going to go specifically as what is listed in the DSM-5. So when you go see your psychiatrist, when you go see your psychologist, when you're first diagnosed with this disorder, this is what they're going to be looking at. Okay, so the diagnostic criteria as listed in the DSM-5 for borderline personality disorder is right here on the screen. To have borderline personality disorder, you would be described as someone with a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image and affects, and marked impulsivity, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following. So if this description fits you and you have 5 or more of these symptoms, then a doctor would say that you have what is called borderline personality disorder, which effectively just means you have a certain set of characteristics that you need to understand how they work and how they impact your life and what you can do to change that, to make your life less impacted by them, basically. That is the burden on someone with a mental illness. So here are the 9 symptoms for borderline personality disorder. I'll give you a little bit of insight into me. I exhibit all 9 of these symptoms. Not everyone does. Some might exhibit 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And because you can exhibit 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and they can be of varying numbers, I think there's something like over 200 different combinations of ways that these symptoms can manifest themselves in one human individual. So when you talk about someone having borderline personality disorder, one person to the next, to the next, to the next isn't necessarily going to understand what the other person is going through. So, number 1, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. And there's a note here, and they're going to note this a couple of different times, that this does not include the suicidal or self-mutilating behaviors covered in Criterion 5. So any efforts would be covered in Criterion 5 if they have to do with suicidality or self-mutilation. So frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. And we're going to go through these symptoms later and talk about how they relate to changes in the brain in another video. Number 2, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. Now, we'll talk about that more in other videos too. That has to do with black or white thinking or splitting, if you've heard those terms in BPD. Number 3, identity disturbance. Markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. So anyone out there who has BPD and has looked in the mirror and thought, who the hell are you? That's why. We'll talk more about these symptoms later, but identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, and this again does not include suicidality or self-mutilating behavior that's covered in Criterion 5. So some of the examples of these impulsivity would include spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating, other things like that. Number 5, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. Number 6, affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. For example, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. So here you're talking about mood swings that can be rapid or extreme. And also that same emotional dysregulation, marked reactivity of mood. It has a lot to do with emotional dysregulation, I think. Number 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. This is one that sometimes is really hard for people to define. I had this pit in my stomach that I could describe as an empty pit in my stomach my whole life, but I didn't know until I was 35 and I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder that having this empty feeling, this empty pit in my stomach, was a symptom of a disorder that I had had my whole life. And I never knew. I always thought it was just a flaw. Inappropriate, intense anger, or difficulty controlling anger. Frequent displays of temper, constant anger, recurrent physical fights. I had a lot of trouble with this symptom when I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, because I am a pacifist and I am nonviolent and I am not an angry person, but I realized that I do have inappropriate, intense anger and difficulty controlling my anger. I just didn't have it outwardly. I had it inwardly. My anger and rage is in here. I just never let it out. I let it seethe, but it was always there. So I had a lot of trouble with my diagnosis based on that right there. I said, I can't be borderline. I'm not mean. But that's just not true. That's a stigma. It's a stigma. And it's a stigma that I'm looking to stop. Transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. That's a big sentence. So paranoia. You get stressed because you're paranoid. Sometimes you get looped into your own paranoia. That's that paranoid ideation where you're going over and over those thoughts over and over again. Severe dissociative symptoms. Dissociation is sort of like an out-of-body experience where you sort of feel like you're there, but you're not there, in a fog. People have a lot of different ways of describing dissociation. We'll talk about that more later too. So that's borderline personality disorder according